Good morning, precious family of God. Every single week, we had 70 in the face this morning, and I don't have a count yet for this service, but it's looking very, very good. Isn't it good to get back into at least some semblance of routine? You know, just ignore the masks and the blue tape and not being able to touch each other, and it's almost like normal. So that's a good thing. Let's open up our Bibles, if you would, this morning, over to the book of Colossians, chapter 3, verses 12 through 21. Now, this is a text that I have no doubt you will have heard before. It's somewhat familiar to us. It's one of those passages that is often quoted, but seldom looked at within its total context. In fact, what we do with a lot of different passages is we tend to pull out, because our translators for our English Bibles have tried to help us by dividing things into little sections. Have you noticed that? Perhaps you have a Bible that doesn't do that, but the vast majority of us, especially if you have a study Bible, they divide, even within the chapters, into little blocks, right? And they put a caption over that block and they say, this section is about this or about that. Well, the last part of these verses that we're going to read today has to do with family. But we're going to back up and kind of pretend that break isn't there, because in the original language, when the Apostle Paul wrote this letter, he didn't put any breaks in there. He wrote it as one message, so those things should be tied together in a symbiotic way where you realize that when he's telling us about this, he preceded it with these words so that we could better understand his overall message. So we're going to try to look at that overall context as we look at the subject of family. March the 14th, 1992 is one of the most precious dates in my life. Where all those 28, 29 years ago, Lenore and I became married, and it was in the little community center of the mobile home park where my parents lived out in Richland, Washington. And our wedding wasn't, my daughters have had much more elaborate weddings because my folks didn't have the ability to do more. So we rented the little community center, and the hors d'oeuvres were things my folks bought at the grocery store. They rolled up the little cream cheese meat rolls. Those are delicious, by the way, for a cheap snack. Creamed, and they bought the little quiches in bulk, and that's what we had. And we had a nice little crowd there. My daddy did the service. I had wooed Lenora into relationship through singing to her on my guitar. So I played our song as she walked down the aisle, and I still remember, I knew that by heart. I knew every chord. My fingers had been programmed to pick through every note to perfection, and I messed it up so bad when she walked around the corner in that dress, and I was awestruck. And I realized this is the greatest day of my life, and I messed up the verse. It's just great memories, And then we went from there, and our kids went to much more elaborate locations for their honeymoons. It's amazing to me where people go at 22 years old on their honeymoons today, because we drove about 2 hours away and planned to stay in a Motel 6 until a member of the church bought us 2 nights at a little bit nicer place. Not a Super 8, even a little bit nicer than that. So we stayed there for 2 nights, and we just had the best time, and we still laugh about it. I went and wanted to buy Lenore something on our honeymoon. We didn't have much money, but I bought her a fishing reel because I thought that would be a good thing for us to do together. Guys, not a good idea. Don't ever buy your wife a fishing reel or a treadmill. Not a good idea. So I remember that day like it was yesterday. And it's not just precious because it's the day I made a commitment to the love of my life, who I'll spend the rest of my life with. It's also a precious day because it marked the beginning of our family. It was the beginning of our family. Everything we've had and been since, our children, it all began that day. Our grandchildren, it all began that day. And family If we don't do family right, then what does it matter anything else we do in this life? The Bible calls the church the family of God. It refers to him metaphorically as our Father, and we are his children. Jesus is called the Son of God. All that language is wrapped in the concept of family. Family is so desperately important to existence and victorious living in this world. But the truth is that from the first day you're married and you start to build that family, it's not always easy, is it? In fact, you can even start, some folks have a rough patch right at the beginning. For Lenore and I, they always say, people have the different numbers. They say, well, when you get past year 3, then you're over the hump. Or you get past year 7, you're over the hump. Ours has been kind of like one of those double-humped camels, it's just hump, and then you get over it and hump, and that's kind of the way family really is. So don't let anybody tell you there's one hump. It's multiple humps. And you get over them, and then things get great, and then you're going to have struggles again. That's family. And even from the first day, it can be a challenge. One of my good friends who's a preacher talks about when he and his wife got married, and it was years ago like us, and they didn't have much, so they just drove to another community, got them a hotel room. But on Sunday morning, they went to church. And they found out he was a preacher. So on his honeymoon, that church asked him to preach, and they gave him a topic. They said, we want you to preach on heaven. And he told me, he said, brother, I was so grateful that they didn't ask me to preach on the opposite of heaven on my honeymoon. I thought that would have been the worst thing imaginable. He said, so maybe that lesson set us up for good. You see, from the very beginning, there's going to be challenges. Families have struggles. My sister Melanie, now you won't believe this because she's the sweetest person, but it took me 30 years to realize it. Because we fought like cats and dogs when we were young, mostly because she was always telling on me and she never did anything wrong. But still, we struggled. And my parents were like, you need to love each other. But families have their issues. They struggle. But it's so very important that we get it right. Because from creation itself, family was vital to what God said was important for living. In Genesis 2:18, it says, and the Lord God said, it is not good that man should be alone. So I will make a helper for him, compatible to him. God did not intend us to be alone. And then, of course, in Genesis 2:21 through 25, and the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall on Adam, and he slept, and he took one of his ribs, and he closed up the flesh in its place. And then the rib which the Lord took from the man, he made into a woman, and he brought her to the man. And Adam said, this is now bone of my bone. This is flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. I don't think that really was kind of a dry expression, because I think Adam, when he saw her the first time, said, whoa, man. Kind of like I did when she walked around the corner that day 28 years ago. Whoa, man. What is God given to me? Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall become one flesh. God instituted family from the very beginning, and he said mankind is not complete without it. But many times it's hard. You just look at Old Testament and New Testament characters, and you're going to see that family can be hard. Some of the greatest heroes of faith had a lot of struggles in their family. Abraham is the father of faith. But you remember Abraham, when he and Sarah were up in their older years, and they so wanted a family. They wanted children. And God came and said, I'm going to give you children. And he laughed at God. And then Sarah, later on, she laughed at God as well. And God asked her this question. He said, is anything too hard for the Lord? He said, I know you're up in your older years. They were, 100 years old. And he says, but is anything too hard for the Lord? Folks, we live in a world where people are struggling in their families. In fact, we talk about felt needs evangelism, and indeed there are a lot of folks in this community we can meet their needs and feed them and provide some of those physical needs that they have in their lives, and we might be able to teach them. But there are other needs that people who drive a Mercedes or a Lexus, they're just as much in need. And most of the time it's because they're failing with their kids or their marriages are falling apart. Folks, people need the Lord because they need their families. And if you don't have the guidebook for family, it's hard. It's hard. I wonder if Abraham ever sat back after that day as he's watching Isaac playing and smile and laugh again. But laugh to himself. Not that he didn't think God could do it anymore, but laugh at his doubt. Laugh at his doubt. Don't you think people probably thought he was a little crazy sitting there laughing to himself? It's kind of like the fellow I heard about in the airport. He was laughing and people were looking. He wasn't talking to anybody. Somebody said, well, what are you laughing for? He said, well, I'm telling myself jokes. It keeps me company because I don't have anybody else. That's kind of sad part of it. Don't have anybody else. And they said, but you laughed really hard once. He said, yeah, I hadn't heard that one before. Abraham, he laughed at God, but then he laughed at his own foolishness later. Because God gives us the tools, the resources to raise our families. And in this text, we have, at the close of it, some basic instructions about family that we've read many, many times. Where he says in verse 18, wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and do not be bitter towards them. Children, obey your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing to the Lord. And fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath. So he addresses every dynamic of the family unit. He says, wives, you should be this way. Husbands, be this way. Parents, be this way. Children, be this way. And we read that and it's kind of like clinical instructions. But you understand, that's only when we pull these 4 verses out without looking at what's said around them. They come to life when we back up in the text to verse 12. And this, we know this section well as well. Because it tells us, therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, out of tender mercies, put on tender mercies, kindness, humility, meekness, long-suffering, bearing with one another, and forgiving one another. If anyone has a complaint against another, even as Christ forgave you, so also you must do. And above all things put on love, which is the bond of perfection. And let the peace of God which rules, let it rule in your heart, to which also you were called in one body, and be thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly with all wisdom, teaching, admonishing one another in psalms, hymns, spiritual songs, singing with grace in your hearts to the Lord. Now, oftentimes we'll just pull verse 16 out when we're talking about worship or what we should do corporately. But that's not exactly, now he has application in that, but that's not the whole context. His context is how we're supposed to live every day. And he's going to follow it by saying, you most importantly must apply this in your family. That's why he immediately goes into, after whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord. He says, therefore, wives, submit to your husbands. Husbands, love your wives. Don't be bitter with them. Children, obey your parents as is fitting in the Lord. Fathers, don't provoke your children to wrath, because these are the kind of people you're striving to be. And you cannot be a person who lives a life pleasing to the Lord. This kind of life, sacrificial, loving, if you do it outside and you don't do that at home. Who you are begins with who you are at home. That's what he's telling us. It begins in your home with your family. Notice that the center of all of this is verse 14. But above all these things put on love, which is the bond of perfection. We notice back in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 5, there's a really neat text, because sometimes people look at the Old Testament Levitical law and think that it's just this hard code where some people get power over another. But look at Deuteronomy 24:5. When a man has taken a new wife, God said in his law, this is his instruction, he will not go out to war or be charged with any business, for he shall be free at home for 1 year. You know why? To bring happiness to his wife, whom he has taken. God says before, when you're married, before you get about any other business, before you prioritize anything else, you make your spouse happy. You make your children happy. You prioritize your home. If that isn't all about love, then I don't know what is. Because a home where there's happiness is a home where there's joy. Proverbs 15:17, better is a dinner of herbs where love is. Better it is to be married in a trailer park with cheese roll-ups as your hors d'oeuvres. Better is a dinner with herbs where love is than a fatted calf with hatred. You see, I love this text because it says, when it encourages us to put on love, because it says it's the bond of perfection. None of us are ever going to be perfect. But the only step towards perfection is love. And when he says bond of perfection, this really is interesting to me, because Melanie, I know, will share this sentiment. When I think of the most perfect person I know, and I know she wasn't perfect, because sometimes I heard her when I was growing up, she'd get frustrated about something and she'd say a word or two that frankly she would have whooped us for saying those words, okay? But my grandmother, Ethel Certain, was the finest, most perfect human being in my little 8-year-old boy mind that I've ever known. And it wasn't because she was perfect. I don't know if she finished high school. She certainly wasn't highly educated. She, as we said, sometimes she had a little bit of a temper and all of this. But my grandfather died the day he found out I was going to be born. So before I was ever born, my grandma was a widow for years and years and years. And every year she'd come and stay 3 months with us wherever we were living. And all I know is those were 3 months that could only be categorized if you had to put one word label on it: love. Because a growing boy is hungry all the time. And if it was at midnight, my grandma would poke her head out of her room and say, "Are you hungry?" And the answer was always the same: "Yes, I'm hungry." And I have had so many midnight grilled cheese sandwiches that my grandma in her nightgown would go in there, and always with a smile on her face. Always overjoyed. And that woman wasn't perfect, but to me she was perfect. Because to me all I knew was love from her. Put on love, which is the bond of perfection. Now when we think about what this means, love in our homes, the truth is we have to go a little deeper, because our society uses the word love all the time. And they do not know what they're talking about most of the time. In fact, I don't insult people, but I kind of smile at times when people talk about love and, oh, we're so in love. And then maybe the relationship lasts a month or 5 months or 5 years or whatever it is. People don't know what love is. Let me tell you, one of the best ways to define something is to define what it isn't, what it's not. This love he's talking about here, we know several things that our society mixes up, but we know this is not what love is. So it tells us that the opposite is always true, and that is, and they all start with a T, so they'll be easy for you to remember. 5 things. Number 1, love is not trivial. It isn't trivial. Trivial things. Trivia? What is that? Well, my kids say all the time, because I'm that nerdy guy who likes documentaries, so I have a lot of useless knowledge. And they say, "You have a lot of that trivial knowledge, Dad. It's of no use whatsoever. Until I get on a game show, then it might be." But I do. It's trivial because it doesn't really matter, right? Love. I mean, we live in a world where people see love as trivial. People throw out that word all the time. Oh, we went on a date. I love you. We've been seeing each other 3 weeks and we're so in love. You know, people just throw that word around like it's trivial. And if you ask somebody, well, how many, you know, there are folks who've dated and dated and dated and they've loved everyone. How many folks have you loved? That's trivial. Love in the Bible is not trivial. It is meaningful. It is profound. It is a valuable investment. In John chapter 13, 34 and 35, Jesus said, a new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another as I have loved you. That isn't trivial. If it is, then the cross was meaningless. By this all will know that you're my disciples, by the love you have for one another. Not the way you use the word, by the kind of love you have. Not a trivial love. Secondly, love is not just talk. It's not just talk. There was a rock song years ago, more than words is what it takes to make me know that you love me. So easily do people just use the words, I love, I love, I love. But if you don't see actions behind the words, those words will be meaningless. In 1 John 3, 18 and 19, my little children, let us not love in word or in tongue, but in deed and in truth. And by this we will know that we are of the truth and shall assure our hearts before him. He said, don't just love with your tongue, love with your actions. Because love is not just talk. Love is not just touch. It's not just a pat on the back. How you doing? Shaking hands, giving a hug. All of these things are good within the context of love, but in and of themselves, that isn't love. It's more than just a touch. Remember Judas? When he came to Jesus, he kissed him. When he betrayed him, it wasn't love. It's more than a trade-off. People, I hear it all the time. Well, we need to try to have a 50-50 relationship. Let me tell you, young folks, when you get married, you better not think of it that way or your marriage will fail 100%. If we're using percentages. 50-50 relationships equals 100% a marriage is going to fail. Because the truth is no one lives up to what they're committing themselves to all of the time. So this is what you need to commit yourself to. I'm going to give myself 110% of everything I am to this relationship and to that person. I'm going to put them first. I'm going to sacrifice how I feel. And if you both do that, then you've got 220%. You got a lot of leeway there to give with. It's not a trade-off. And finally, it's not a tingling. It's not just a good feeling. Oh, I had some good feelings that day she walked around the corner. But you don't have those. I mean, in 28 years of marriage, Lenore ain't always felt good about the man she shares her life with. And less often, but I haven't always either. I mean, there's humps. It's ups and downs. And if it's just based upon a tingling, based upon a feeling, but people put so much stock in that, don't they? I remember hearing about a father who was concerned about his boy and the girl that he was dating, that she wouldn't be a good influence and a good partner throughout his life. And he said, son, did you reconsider this? But Dad, I know she's the right one because when I touch her, the way it makes me feel, I'm tingling all over. And he said, son, it might be because she's cold. I mean, tingling. That isn't real love. So it's not trivia. It's not talk. It's not touch. It's not a trade-off. It's not a tingling. What is it? Well, he tells us right here in the text. Love is an action. In verse 12 it says, therefore as the elect of God, holy and beloved, put on tender mercies and kindness and humility, meekness, long-suffering. Put them on. Folks, you got to do that. When you're one of those low points and it doesn't feel, and your kids make you so upset or your spouse makes you so upset, you've got to take and put forth the effort to put on. And it's a heavy garment in that moment. But you put on tender mercies, loving kindness, gentleness, and forgiveness. You see, it's an act. We've got to stop allowing the world to influence us. The world has it wrong every single time. They believe love is a feeling. A feeling is not love. A feeling sometimes comes from love, but feelings also come from hate and everything ugly in this world. Feelings cannot rule your life. You have to be their master. And I've heard a proverb that I think is so true. It's easier to act your way into a better way of feeling than it is to feel your way into a better way of acting. In other words, that old wisdom of fake it till you make it is pretty good wisdom. I've had people, well, I'm not going to act. Well, that's insincere. That's hypocritical. No, it's you saying, I'm going to try to be the person I should be. Not this incomplete, unloving person I am. It's easier to act your way into feeling a certain way than it is to feel your way into the right way of acting. You see, love is an action regardless of how you feel. Think about the mother. My daughter has a baby. Nathan and his sweet wife, they have one of the sweetest babies I know, and I know at times y'all don't want to get up in the middle of the night because babies are the most selfish human beings in the world. They are. They're the sweetest thing in the world, but they're only sweet by nature, not by action, right? I mean, because a baby never thinks in the middle of the night, you know, my mom's gotten up so much with me, it wouldn't be kind for me to I'm just going to endure my wet diaper or endure that I'm hungry and I'm going to wait a little while because I love my mama. No baby in the history of the world, even Jesus, I would guess, ever did that. But you know what mamas do? What they want to do is they want to walk in there because they're so exhausted. They probably feel a little frustration, but a mama doesn't take that frustration out on her baby. Not if she's a good mama. She goes in there and she cradles him and she gives him love, even though he's screaming in her face. She gives him love. She acts her way into a better way of feeling. What about a man who sacrifices for his family? I know a man who I admire more than he will ever know, who, because he loves his family, even though he's retired, he works another job and he works weekend jobs, and he's a humble guy who would never make a big deal out of it, but this man loves his family and wants to provide them the best way of life, and he works and works, and still he has the attitude. Anybody, even though I know he's tired all the time, even if anybody asks him to do anything, give him the shirt off their back, and he'll do it, and he'll do it always with a smile on his face. And that is the definition of love. And that's what makes a family work. You see, when we examine Paul's instruction as he gives that clinical commandment, husbands do this, wives do this, children be this way, parents be this way, what he's really saying to them is you be a people who develop the right kind of love in your home. And if you do, you'll be able to be a husband who loves his wife, a wife that submits to their husband, children who obey their parents, parents who don't exasperate their kids, because in your home, love is king. Real love, not a love that is trivial, not a love that is simply talk or touch or a trade-off, not a love that is just about a tingling, but a love that says, I'm going to make the effort to put on forgiveness, tender mercies, patience. Love is what makes this world matter. But love is often hard. As we think about the people we want to be in our community, at work, with our friends, we need to first ask ourselves who we are under our own roof. Are we a people who exercise and live out with our kids, with our spouse, biblical love every day? If you need to come this morning, if you need to just say to your spouse, to say to your children, y'all know I love you, but I want to do better. I even want to be more encouraging, more uplifting. Let me tell you, you might think it'd be embarrassing to come forward, but it'll mean something to the people sitting next to you if you need to say that. Come right now as we stand and as we sing.